Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second plenary at Urban Arc 2022. I'm really excited for today's discussion because it focuses on something that we all struggle with, but don't often get the opportunity to talk about. Collaborative research, co-producing knowledge, and building long-term partnerships, whether with individuals or with institutions, has always been a challenge for those who are involved in research. However, over the last 2 to 3 years with the pandemic, this has become even more challenging. So today's panel is going to reflect on our experiences of having worked together through Peak Urban, and also on our experiences of having worked together, not just with each other, but also over the years in multi-country research partnerships across the North and the South, and reflects on the challenges of doing research in these circumstances, and why this kind of research is important, and what and how we can do to continue to build and sustain long-term partnerships through the building of genuine collaborative frameworks. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce the panelists. All of us have been working together for the last 3 to 4 years through Peak Urban, which is a GCRF-funded research project, and you can look us up on the Peak Urban website, and there's lots more information on our work over there. So the first set of speakers, Michael Keith and Sue Parnell, will open and set us off on the panel. Michael is professor at the Center of Migration Policy and Society at the University of Oxford and the director of the Peak Urban Research Program. His research focuses on migration-related processes of urban change. Sue Parnell is the deputy principal investigator with Peak Urban. She's an urban geographer and holds a chair in human geography at the University of Bristol, and her research focuses on contemporary urban policy research and urban environmental justice. Over to you, Michael and Sue. Thank you.
Thanks, Neha, and thanks to IHS for the chance to put this panel together. Sue and I are going to be talking sequentially, and I'm going to say an introduction about some of the background, and then Sue is going to talk more about the substance of the work we're doing before we lead into the real meat of the session today, the contribution from colleagues across India, Colombia, and South Africa about some of the opportunities and challenges of working internationally on a collaboration like ours. As Neha set out at in the introduction, our collaboration is actually funded by something called the Global Challenge Research Fund, which is a major funding initiative that was set up by the UK government in 2011 in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis as a way of rethinking the priorities of research within the UK, but within the UK's relationship to the rest of the world. The idea being that one should place front and center of a major element of research funding nationally, collaborations across the world, but also across academic traditions, across disciplines, to think about what the challenges that face the future of the planet in the years to come. And our program, unsurprisingly, in the context where we're speaking today, was focused on the challenges facing cities of the future. And Sue will be saying more about what we chose to do. But in my introduction, obviously part of that story is that we were incredibly pleased to be successful in gaining fairly significant resources for all of us, all partners, to put together an incredibly exciting initiative. But we were all faced with the challenges of the pandemic that has run through the last 24 months, right in the center of our program. And to some extent, even more so, part of that story are the challenges of the rational or less than rational behavior of funders in response to that pandemic. It seems, and I think it is only a part of the story, but and there is also a danger, I think, that when the globe has faced the scale of horror that it has done, academics look somewhat self-indulgent when they start complaining about their own position in relation to things. But in the context of recognizing that, what happened with our own funding was that in the UK, part of the British government's response, I think culpably so, was to respond to a global pandemic and a consequent crash of the national economy and GDP by saying that not only was something that I think I'm actually fairly proud of, not proud of too many things to do with the UK actions of the last 20 or 30 years, but there is a commitment in law to commit 0.7% of GDP towards achieving sustainability and translation of money to realize the Sustainable Development Goals across the globe. And the UK government, in response to the pandemic, decided to suspend that legal obligation and reduce it to 0.5% instead of 0.7%. Our research councils are our funders. We could also discuss at greater length, but their reaction to that was that rather than to cash flow what was always going to be a challenge, because if the 0.7% was always going to be 0.7% of a smaller figure as the economy crashed, the 0.7% being reduced to 0.5% generated what was then described as a £120 million gap in funding for programs such as ours. And what happened was that although it wasn't translated immediately, which was itself was quite problematic, it took about 6-7 months after the change in funding was known globally. There was an announcement that reduced the funding to programs like ours by a significant sum, approximately 6.5% of the funding of the whole program, to be delivered within 2 months over the final year of a research program. It's an extraordinarily high figure when you think about it. And it was impacted on a range of projects of our generation of major programs funded by the Global Challenge Research Fund. And so what we're talking about today is in part both how we put together that alliance of collaborators, but also how that impacted on our work. But the beginning of the story, I guess, is why we think that the future of the city, the challenges of the future of the city as understood globally rather than parochially, is actually core to one of the global challenges. And at that point, I'll hand over to Sue.
Yeah, thanks, Michael, and thanks, Neha. I mean, to reiterate, the cuts were unacceptable, unanticipated, and disruptive. But one of the things that it did make us do was to be more articulate about what it was that we were doing and, in a way, why it was important. And being forced to do that, I think, was good not just for us, but is probably an important thing for the urban intellectual community to do. And so I just want to try and summarize, if I can, very briefly, what we thought was valuable in that kind of starting of a reflection. And the first thing I think it's helpful to do is to say, what do we mean by a global urban research agenda? So that was what was being funded. And we've probably all thought about this in different ways, but we have got different entry points. So for some, a global program is one that is comparative. In other words, you are comparing sites across the globe. For other people, it's summative. In other words, when you take all cities everywhere, what are the big trends? For some, it means a representative agenda. In other words, not one dictated, for example, by the Global North, or not one that leaves out small cities, or not one that leaves out informality. You can think of it in any number of those ways, but so it's a representative agenda. I think for some, and increasingly I think within Peak, we think of the global agenda as one that is collective. In other words, an agenda where we can think about the future city as from all of us, generically. You'll hear me talking a little bit about why we think that a global urban agenda is a deeply political process, and that was embedded in our thinking about Peak. But in other words, just because you're operating and thinking about global events and global processes and global representation, summative categories, doesn't mean that you lose the political from the urban. And by implication, we thought that a global urban agenda should also be an interdisciplinary agenda. In other words, it wasn't confined to the analysis of public administration, or it wasn't confined to the analysis of urban energy. You couldn't talk about cities in a global way unless it had all of those elements. And being forced to spell that out, I think, was actually really quite useful. The second thing that we had to then do was really be able to say, okay, it should be self-evident that is important. In other words, that cities are a fundamental part of any kind of global thinking, and that we can think about cities in a global way. But we wanted to go further to talk about why international collaboration to generate a global urban agenda was important. And if we had longer time together, we could amplify this, but just to give you some sense of the sorts of things that we thought about and came up with was some of the most obvious kinds of points, which is, of course, ideas about cities do not respect international boundaries. We obviously need multiple empirical vantage points if we are going to be talking about cities in any kind of less than specific or case-based way. We know that intellectual power and skill and experience is not located in a single place. So you've got to be drawing expertise from multiple sites and multiple sources. And probably the most important thing within the Peak project was our conviction that we needed collective thought in order to address a complex problem. And it was very clear to us, as I think I've already alluded to, that getting to grips with the global urban agenda demands thinking in complex ways and acknowledging complexity. So the idea that a research team in a place or an individual would be able to drive something of this scale was a non-starter. And that had already put us into a slightly different position in terms of the nature of the international collaborations that we were able to put together under this GCRF call in the Peak program. And for us, that was very significant because we were not just defending the importance of what we did or the importance of a mode of international collaboration, but we also wanted to underscore the importance of the way that the GCRF project had facilitated the composition of an international team. So for those of you who don't have as many gray hairs as either Michael or I do, who may have been involved in earlier programs on international urban collaboration, and there have been some, and it's not brand new, the first time this has ever happened, that there's been a big international project. But I think that this generation of projects was actually different in the sense that I think earlier programs have tended to be much more extractive. In other words, they wanted to know something specific about ports or something specific about urban labor markets. Or alternatively, they were overtly developmental. In other words, and for many years, that was true of how the UK government funded any urban research. In other words, it only looked at poverty. And it was only questions of poverty that got any funding. So they were case specific. They weren't interested in general ideas or trends. And if they were, it was only around very specific points of comparison. And the division of labor in older projects was almost always that there was a kind of intellectual hub in the north with a kind of hands and feet doing the operational stuff in the global south. And we'll hear, and we haven't done it perfectly, and nobody's suggesting that we have, but I think there were attempts to and successes in trying to drive Peak in an alternative way. And perhaps I can just highlight a few of those, and if you could kind of listen for these as we move through our points of departure from other speakers on some of these issues. I think the first thing is to be able to say that what Peak was interested in and sought to explore, to explode, to expand were general ideas about urban change. We needed to come together to think about how cities can, have, and will change and will be the agents of change. So general point there. The second thing, and I think this panel demonstrates that, is that the intellectual leadership was distributed both thematically and locationally. That's not just true of kind of most established cohorts. There were significant opportunities within Peak for researcher-to-researcher collaborations to grow and mature. Sorry, I'm sitting in Cape and I have alarm bells behind me. I hope they're not disrupting you. That's the other thing I think which Peak, sought to do, which was different from some of those earlier projects, was that it was interested in the whole city and interested in the system of city, and it was interested in the process of urbanization. So the object of study was quite a general synthetic one and not a particular one. That doesn't mean we didn't have particular projects in the program, but no particular project on a particular place was ever allowed to be completely isolated. There was always a relational dialogue between those findings and others. And perhaps most importantly for the theme of this meeting and the theme of the conference was, I would argue that we had a kind of a mixed, a trans and non-binary, if you like, kind of a set of research methods. And that was an explicit point of departure for Peak, was that we did not wish to privilege the most powerful methods of research. We did not wish to isolate any particular research method and approach, but rather we sought very actively to establish an inclusive set of methods. And yeah, I think that opens up a set of risks. In international funding, Michael's already alluded to one, is that it can be insecure. The other is that, 4 years sounds like a long time. It doesn't always deliver in that time. It rests on extraordinary trust across places. And it really does hinge on a disposition that is shared across research partners to enable 100 flowers to bloom and then to be able to see what comes from that and to seek to synthesize. I started off by saying that Peak was deeply embedded in the idea of the politics of cities, even at the global scale. And that, of course, is the biggest risk that we face, is that what we find and how we find it, who we find it with, is not necessarily politically acceptable, politically palatable, politically implementable. And of course, that is always a risk. But perhaps on that one, Michael, I can hand back to you.
Thanks, Sue. I'm going to just wrap up with a couple of very brief comments about managing uncertainty and accidental insights. We know that, as Sue just said, cities are complex. We think of them as complex and open systems. So they're subject to instability. They're subject to shocks. We were subject both to the shock of the pandemic and also the shock of the funding cut that we described. And in a sense, if we're thinking about what might have been the known unknowns or the unknown unknowns, the known unknowns were potentially the shock of a major disruption. The unknown unknowns were more the irrational behavior of our funders. I think we all shared a sense, and there's a culpability there, as I said earlier on. But one or two of the insights that I think came from this, which, just to wrap up, builds on something that Sue was just saying, that we set out with a purpose of a distributed sense of the production of knowledge. Many of these large programs that work in a number of different countries try to do the same thing in each country. I think one of the things that was quite important about our approach was that we did, from the very start, have about 40 projects that were sourced locally, developed locally, and sat within an overall umbrella. So Peak Urban gave us, as Sue described, a disposition, a framework, a way of placing our interrogation of cities into a particular set of questions and concepts. But all of the projects then came from the grassroots. And that was built upon and built in turn that sense of trust that Sue invoked. So one of the insights that came about was, I think, because of that grassroots structure, when we were challenged by major funding, and I think I'd need to go on the record here again to say that the trust relations paid back in the sense that there was a collaboration and a sharing of pain diplomatically, deliberatively, and in good faith by all partners, our partners in Beijing, who aren't represented today, but also our partners in South Africa and Colombia, who are represented by Andy and Juan, and in India by Neha and Aramar Ravi and colleagues, all of whom actually took this on board collectively, dealt with it collectively. And one minor advantage that we did have was that from that diversity, precisely because we were not a convoy of a single ship that was then stalled in the pandemic, there was an advantage that both the pandemic itself and our ability to do research, but also the funding cuts, impacted differently at different times for different partners and even different projects within different partners. And so a number of things were still achievable that might not have been if we had been a single ship moving at a single space, landing the same conceptual framework, landing the same project on all of the cities we studied. And for that, I'm incredibly grateful, but we're going to hear much more about that from Juan, from Andy, and from Neha. So I'm going to hand over to them. But as I say, it is in a spirit of thanks to them and all of the colleagues for their response to those challenges we faced, but also with thanks for the kind of trust relations that I would suggest are the greatest lesson of all in terms of developing these sorts of relations longer term. Thanks. Over to you, Neha.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Michael and Sue, for getting us started. I'll hand over now to Juan Carlos Duque, who is a professor in the Department of Mathematical Sciences at the EAFIT University of Medellin, and also the founder director of the Research in Spatial Economics, or RISE group. He's also co-investigator from Colombia on the Peak Urban program. His research on regional science, operation research, and spatial analyses has been published widely in leading international journals. And over to you, Juan.
Hello, everyone. Neha, thank you so much for your introduction, and thanks to the IISH for the invitation. And thank you all for attending this panel. I'm going to share my screen. A second here. Can you see my slides?
Yeah.
Okay, so my talk has two parts. In the first part, I want to show how economic growth in Colombia is paradoxically affecting the research dynamics in this country. And what I'm going to show you here about Colombia is also happening in many other countries in this region. And second, I want to show how this lack of resources, which is aggravated by the economic impact of this pandemic, may affect the way in which the global north and the global south are studying urban problems. Okay, so according to this figure, during the last 2 decades, Colombia's GDP has been growing at an average rate of 4% per year. In 2011, this country transitioning from lower middle to upper middle income country. And in 2020, Colombia became the 37th country to join the OECD. All this looks great, amazing. But now let me show you how this economic growth has impacted research funding in Colombia. I'm going to start first with the external funding. So the transition to an upper middle income country reduced the incoming ODA flows. ODA stands for Official Development Assistance, and about 6% of ODA is intended to support research activities. So this figure shows that the ODA to upper middle income countries represent about 40% of ODA to low middle income countries. So in summary, becoming an upper middle income country significantly reduced the possibility to access external funds for research, which is fair and makes sense. But here, let me show you what is happening regarding the internal funding. As you can see in this figure, the percentage of GDP devoted to R&D in Colombia is the lowest compared to other countries in the OECD. In Colombia, just 0.2% of our GDP goes to R&D. Now you can understand why this reduction in the external funding is critical for us, because internally there are no much resources for R&D. And this is mainly because we have a highly informal economy. About 50% of companies are informal here in Colombia, and therefore the tax collection is too low. In Colombia, the tax revenue as a percentage of GDP is about 16% compared to 33% average for the OECD. So these two conditions leave the government with no resources for R&D. They have to cover other priorities first. And if we expect the private sector to fund research, we have bad news because corporate taxes in Colombia are about 25% compared to 10% for the OECD. So in summary, we are ending up without public, private, or external resources to fund the research here in Colombia. This panorama of low public and private investment in R&D, decreasing ODA, and cuts to research due to COVID occurs in a period in which urban research is experiencing very interesting dynamics. And let me highlight three of those dynamics here in this slide. First, today the world is more aware that cities are complex and globally interconnected. Second, we as humanity identify a set of global challenges faced by cities and included those challenges in the SDGs. And third, the academic community is realizing that the solution of global urban problems requires an integral understanding of those problems. And these three characteristics are reflecting, among others, into a growing interest in studying Latin American cities. You can see here, this is 2015. This trend here is very interesting. And also it reflects into a sophistication of the collaboration networks between urban research in the North and the South. You can see here each column describes 5 years periods starting from 2000. So you can see here how the collaboration networks have been evolving through time, involving more and more countries collaborating with Latin American countries. And if you take a look to the topics that are addressed on those papers, you will see that they are all global topics. So this is not about researchers from around the world studying Latin American problems, but about researchers from around the world seeking for a better understanding of global problems by studying how they manifest in Latin America, which is a big difference here. So let me put that here. Okay. So in summary, according to these figures, urban research is going through a very interesting period, which may be seriously affected by this trend towards a decreasing in resources for research. So as a conclusion, I have here 5 potential actions. First, the Colombian government needs urgently to improve tax collection, which is very important. Second, we as research community need to keep exploring different pathways for translation to generate new resources. Third, researchers in middle-income countries can play an important role in facilitating the interaction between researchers from high and low-income countries. And in this way, upper researchers in middle-income countries can still have access to ODA, which is very important, as I already told you or show you. And finally, research funds flowing from developed countries to low and middle-income countries shouldn't be seen as an aid, but as a necessary investment to have an integral understanding of all these global challenges. This is all from this part. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Juan. That was lovely, and it sets up my presentation really well. So I'm going to go next. As most of you probably know, my name is Neha Sami. I'm one of the faculty here at IIHS, also one of the co-investigators from IIHS on the Peak Urban program. And while my slides come up, I'm going to focus, actually stepping back from Peak Urban, rethinking and putting across a set of provocations that would perhaps help us to start rethinking the research funding process. As you've heard from Michael and Sue, in March 2021, the UKRI announced substantial cuts to its research budget, which impacted not only researchers and funders within the UK, but also partners and institutions globally, many of whom were located in the global south. And of course, while the impact of these cuts on critical ongoing and future research and careers of young researchers will continue to be immense and enduring, this paper doesn't focus on the cuts per se, but goes beyond the immediate concerns of these cuts to examine the process by which such research funding and grants are made from researchers, particularly from the perspective of researchers based in the South. It uses this moment of the cuts as an opportunity to reflect on these frameworks through which such grants are structured and the challenges of doing research through such grants to potentially highlight structural inequalities between funding and research programs across the North and South, and to highlight how these inequalities can continue to become re-articulated and reinforced through these funding frameworks. And so in doing that, I draw not only on our experience through Peak Urban, which was a rare opportunity to work collaboratively together across multiple geographies and contexts, but also from IHS's participation in several multi-country collaborative grants over the last decade. There are a set of concerns and challenges that we have come across in our work here. But like Juan said before me, these are not the challenges that are particular to Bangalore or India. If I could have the next slide, please. So participating in such research proposals undoubtedly brings a set of immense opportunities to do innovative research across a set of geographies, disciplines, and contexts. Most crucially, it enables capacity building and provides spaces for young researchers to grow, and also the potential to create long-term research partnerships of the type that we have been attempting to build through Peak Urban. However, the challenges are that a lot of these grants are made and are funded through northern or western frameworks and through agencies based in these locations, in these geographies. They often end up having predetermined approaches in terms of the kinds of theoretical frameworks that they come from, methods that are valorized, and the kinds of output and output frameworks. Moreover, the terrain of knowledge production and dissemination also tends to be deeply skewed in the favor of sort of northern modes of production and dissemination, which in turn tends to reinforce some of these grant-making frames. And what I would like to argue is that as we think about starting to restructure, the contours of research funding and the terrain of urban studies in order to enable sort of genuine non-hierarchical dialogue across different contexts, rethinking and reshaping the funding process itself is critical to opening up knowledge production networks. And I focus on three specific aspects over the course of my presentation. The first are the structures through which these grants are made, the programmatic frameworks, the idea of precarity that such frameworks create, and finally, the amount of time that we have to actually do the kind of work that we would like to do. If I could move to the next slide, please. So to begin with the idea of the structures that form the kind of research funding and the grants that are available to do research. Like you saw from Juan's presentation as well, research ecosystems in the South are not uniformly mature. There is a huge absence of domestic funding sources, as well as sort of the absence of broad financial infrastructure bases that would support faculty and scholars to be able to do this kind of work in northern or western universities. In the absence of such a framework and of such a research environment, the availability of research funding from other sources, particularly sources from outside our domestic environments, becomes critical to be able to enable this kind of work. Many grants also tend to often restrict or exclude certain types of research costs, fieldwork costs, for example, salaries, and also increasingly, there's limited money and funding available for open access fees. As an example, the Economic and Social Research Council in the UK typically tends to limit funding for international partners to up to 30% of the grant value, irrespective of the nature of the work or the number of partners involved. These kinds of restrictions tend to limit the number of partners and the kinds of partners who can participate in these grants, as well as the kind of work that can get done. Since often research budgets with caps like this often do not stretch far with multiple partners. And sort of, we were very lucky with Peak to have the kind of flexibility that we did to do the kind of open-ended work that we wanted to do. Another kind of challenge is sort of the lack of agency or political control within these projects and over the process, for partners from the South. It's very rare that there's sort of an equitable framing of the grant process itself, of the writing of the call itself, as well as then of co-writing the proposal. Structures tend to determine who controls the grant, the kind of impacts that these grants need to produce and that are valued, and how these impacts are created and credited. And so what I argue is that it is equally important, while we make researchers accountable to funding and funding sources, to also give agency to researchers and to the subjects of this research, many of whom are often located in the South, and currently structures and the frameworks of these grant processes tend to not allow that. Moving on to the question of precarity, and this is particularly critical in the context of shocks like the one that we faced with the funding cuts that came from UKRI. It plays out very differently across different contexts, but to highlight the fact that when domestic funding and consequent is absent, and there's a growing dependence and a consistent dependence on international grants, it creates a system and an ecosystem of research that is based on soft money or research grant support that comes from outside. And so the entire process of doing research itself, I argue, becomes precarious. It's not only the process of research itself, but also employment that is sort of likewise dependent on funding cycles, with researchers in a range of Southern universities having jobs that are linked both to grant duration or the cycle of the grant and their ability to be able to raise future funding to secure their ability to continue to do research. And this kind of precarity is amplified with the kinds of funding or other shocks like the pandemic, and leads often to increased uncertainty around the idea of sort of doing research and research outcomes themselves. And since the larger kind of research ecosystem in a lot of these contexts is not very well developed, it is not just that a few researchers who end up facing these challenges, but rather the majority of the profession itself that becomes quite fragile. And I'm not arguing at all that it is only researchers in the South that have faced these challenges. Undoubtedly, these were faced across the board, the pandemic has been hard, as well as the funding cuts have been hard on people across the world. But more robust research systems like those in the global North are able to absorb these shocks partially and eventually be able to bounce back. However, in the context of, as yet to be developed research ecosystems, as in the case of the South, these impacts are likely to be felt much more intensely and will likely have long-term detrimental impacts. It is also incredibly challenging to be able to build a consistent research program that aims to develop new knowledge in the context of constantly shifting and changing research agendas of the kind that Michael and Sue mentioned at the beginning. And so, it becomes very difficult to hold on to and produce new knowledge. And finally, talking about the question of time, the final point that I would like to make is building on the discussion of both precarity. If you could move to the next slide, to move both onto the question of building on the question of the challenges that emerge from these structures, as well as from precarity, and focuses on the time that's actually available to do research. The actual framework and the kind of asks from these grant projects are changing and have been consistently changing over time. Timelines have become tighter, focused much more specifically on particular kinds of deliverables and outputs. And as you'll hear more from Andy, who will speak next, there's shrinking time that's available for more open-ended research that often we know leads to creative ways of thinking about the kind of global challenges and problems that both the GCRF funds as well as Peak Urban was trying to deal with. There is therefore the real risk of research becoming projectized and losing value as an open-ended process of knowledge creation and problem solving. The lack of support for long-term research projects is, as Sue mentioned earlier, shrinking. And there is an increasing sort of emphasis on short-term projects that require quick turnarounds and very specific outcomes. However, in the absence of the ability to be able to create these longer term partnerships, it becomes incredibly difficult to deliver on shorter duration grants. And in the absence of being able to build these networks and shared research agendas over sort of long time periods across the North and the South is precisely what makes it possible to deliver on sort of quick responses to challenges on the ground, such as we've seen in the case of the pandemic. And so in closing, I would like to suggest that that the question of agency is particularly important and critical across all of the concerns that I have raised here. The process of designing and framing research proposals, their outcomes and impacts need to become broader based. They need to incorporate voices not just from the North, but also from the South, where the research often is actually done. And it is important, I would argue, to bring in the conversation around reframing and reimagining the process of research funding as we continue to talk about the process of decolonizing curricula and research processes. And with that, I'd like to invite Andrew Tucker. And he is the Deputy Director of the African Center for Cities in Cape Town and the co-investigator from ACC on the Peak Urban Program. He has extensive experience working to understand and address inequality across a variety of forms across Africa, and has particularly explored how social markers such as race, sexuality, and gender relate to the urban environment. Over to you, Andy.
Thanks, Neha. I'm just going to share my screen. Can everyone see that? Yeah, yes. Great. So thanks again, Neha, and also thank you to Sue, Michael, and Juan Carlos for their really important interventions, and thank you also for the opportunity to be a part of this session. So building on Neha's talk, I want to start this talk from the premise that short of upending the entirety of the current global funding model for urban South research, which brings with it the very real risks of funding cuts, we should consider what else can be done to build resilience for urban research institutions, primarily in the global South, who exist often on soft-funded monies. In particular, I want to suggest that one way to build this resilience is to look towards expanding the scope of topics or thematics which scholars working in and on the urban South engage with. Using the example of my own interests on sexualities research in Africa, I want to suggest that work on the urban South can be seen to speak to a far wider global set of knowledge debates, which in turn opens up exciting new research avenues and, crucially, provides additional logics, motivations, and possibilities for sustainable funding of partners away from historical centers of privilege. So to look at this in more detail, I want first of all to look at the reasons why scholarship on sexuality, and particularly that which tends to circulate primarily in the global North, and scholarship on the urban South have traditionally not been seen to sit well together. Then I'll look at how it is indeed possible, and some might argue necessary, to try to bridge these different epistemic terrains. As I'll highlight, the reasons for such a bridging are not simply academic in nature, but also bring with it the possibilities of increased resilience via new sources of funding. Okay. So at first glance, there would appear to be several reasons why there hasn't been much overlap between scholarship on sexuality and scholarship on the urban South. First, much work on sexuality, especially in the global North, takes as its starting points the work of the French philosopher Michel Foucault, who famously dates the birth of the homosexual to the 19th century in Northwest Europe. What Foucault was talking about here was the creation of a separate sexual identity in Europe, that of a male homosexual, where previously there had only been the identification of sexual acts. Now, from this starting point, a range of work on topics such as sexual identity politics, social movements, and sexual citizenship arose and have remained important, especially in the global North. The challenge for much of this work, though, is that, as we know from African, Indian, and Latin American contexts, to name but a few, the idea of a particular form of delineated sexual identity in the way that Foucault envisioned it simply does not apply outside of the global north in the same way. There's a risk, therefore, that sexuality-based scholarship, which remains to this day inflected with Foucault's work, can have neo-colonial overtones, a problem especially of note when we consider the significant concern raised by urban theorists of the dangers of applying global north urban theory to southern cities. Indeed, there's a risk here of an implicit assumption that eventually same-sex communities in the global south will someday align with identities and forms of political action that exist in the global north. Not only would this overlook the specificity of local communities in the south, it would also mean that we root theory stays located in the north. Furthermore, another reason why work on sexualities and work on the urban south may not always have sat well together is simply that sexualities work tends to focus on what Nancy Fraser would refer to as a politics of recognition, whereby interest is most heavily focused on issues of identity and representation, sidestepping more pressing development and material concerns, which are of particular interest to urban south scholarship. Yet while there can at first glance appear to be many reasons why scholarship on sexualities which emanate from the global north may not appear to align well with urban south scholarship, I want, in the rest of the time I have now, to suggest that actually there are a number of ways in which such alignment can occur and may in fact be necessary. So first, it's clear that both sexuality scholarship and scholarship on the urban south share a range of key interests. Both fields, for example, are deeply interested in the ways in which urban spaces create opportunities for or hinder urban citizenship, livelihoods, and resilient communities. Both fields are also deeply interested in how healthcare and health-seeking behavior are shaped by a range of place-specific power relations. Both fields are also clearly committed to understanding how political representation and power within cities must be read transversely in terms of urban governance and hierarchically in terms of relations with the state and international processes. But we can also go further. While we may indeed see similarities in terms of shared research interests, we may also want to consider in depth what a melding of sexualities and urban south scholarship could actually look like. And here I want to draw on one example to highlight this point. There are, I think, many others, but for the interest of time, I'm just going to focus on one. So looking at research on the informal sector in the urban south, and especially that in Africa, it is perhaps strange that this research has not directly considered how individuals with same-sex desire exist within it. Now, here it's important to consider how there may well be proportionally large numbers of same-sex desiring individuals in the informal rather than the formal sector compared to the heterosexual population. While no surveys or other research have been conducted specifically on this, evidence from educational research across specifically Africa points towards this hypothesis. Very high rates of severe homophobia in schools across the continent make it far more likely that individuals with same-sex desire who are open about their sexuality or suspected by their peers will drop out or struggle to complete their studies. This may then clearly make it harder for them to find jobs in the formal sector. Now, while the completion of schooling remains a key challenge for many in the region, irrespective of sexuality, and the completion of schooling is but one factor that can support entry into the formal sector, it's important here to consider the additional barriers placed specifically on individuals with same-sex desire, which itself may lead to an overrepresentation of these individuals in the sector. Future research could therefore consider the ways in which informal sector economic activity by same-sex groups may connect to the emergence of sexual and sexual support networks, a topic in relation to the formal sector, which has been well explored within sexualities research in the global north. Work could also consider how individuals with same-sex desire within the informal sector are able to navigate not only economic inequality, but also forms of sexuality-based discrimination to develop successful economic enterprises. Such work could take inspiration from and also go towards directly furthering urban scholarship in the South, which has looked at other populations such as youth and women who face not only economic, but also other intersectional challenges. Limited work to date has highlighted an emergent range of economic enterprises within the informal sector and peri-urban environments in some parts of Africa, including the development of entertainment spaces and service industries run by or targeted at individuals with same-sex desire. Quite how and quite why such activities are successful and can potentially generate sexual support networks can then also help further existing urban theorists' work on the enabling reasons for and strategies to replicate forms of urban innovation. So hopefully, as this brief example has highlighted, there exists important utility in connecting research on the informal sector to research on sexuality. Such work can help expand the scope by which the informal sector is understood and engaged with, and expand our understanding of the types of subjectivities and activities which are imbricated within it. So the point of this brief intervention has been to suggest that there may well be utility in urban South scholars, particularly those located in the South, to look at how it may be possible to expand the scope of research thematics that they currently engage in, and to look at other areas of interest that circulate globally. The reasons to do this, however, are not simply academic in nature. Other fields of study, for example, those focused on sexuality, often draw from research funding grants, which are decidedly different to those which are most often harnessed by urban South scholars. There is, for example, very significant research monies available for work on sexuality and health in the global South, most directly in relation to HIV and other infectious diseases. As just one example, the most recent multi-year funding call by the United States Agency for International Development, or USAID, to support male same-sex groups in 2 cities in South Africa in relation to HIV was over $15.5 million. By comparison, the entire annual primary healthcare budget for South Africa, according to the South African National Treasury, is only $20 million. So the sheer scale and scope of the funding that's being directed here, and the fact that it is overtly focused on the urban, it's overtly focused on cities, is something that urban South scholars may want to consider thinking about in more detail. Expanding the scope of possible funding pots, therefore, has the potential also to increase the resilience of work in and on the urban South. Yet, and to return to the point that Neha was making, such work, it must also be recognized, obviously requires the time and resources of scholars, especially in the South, to develop new and innovative research projects, and the time to write new funding proposals to funders that they may well be unfamiliar with, which will clearly obviously require the effort, resources, and time that with the recent funding cuts are now clearly in decreasing supply. So without wishing to end this talk on a low point, it is worth considering that the effort that will be needed to increase resilience may need to be undertaken under situations of precarity, with the hope that eventually the outcome of increased funding resilience by expanding into new areas will one day limit the precarity that is currently felt by many urban scholars working in and on the South. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. And while I'd like to encourage everyone who's listening to please pop their questions either into the chat box or the Q&A. But we do have one question, which perhaps either Michael or Sue could address, which is focused on more of a commentary, focused on sort of the paradox, seemingly, on the funding cuts on research funding, while doctoral funding seems to have been opening up. I don't know if Michael or Sue, you'd like to comment on this.
Michael, I'm going to hand over to you. I mean, I'm sure you have lots of things to say about this, but I mean, there's a huge politics to research funding, as we know. There's a really interesting debate in the UK about being led, in fact, by somebody called Adam Habib, who used to be the Vice Chancellor at Wits University in Johannesburg, and around the role of where people should train and whether institutions in the global north should in fact be accepting doctoral candidates at all. So you can debate this one in many different ways. You know, should there be funding for doctoral students globally and open? Should actually the plethora of higher institutions in the global north be taking any graduate students from the global south at all? I think it's a much wider debate than, and certainly for me has quite difficult elements to it, but I'd be interested to hear what Michael says. You're muted, Michael.
After 24 months, one might learn. After there is a sense in which doctoral studentships are both a form of migration and also a movement of talent. And although much of the talk, if you look at certainly most of Northern Europe, maybe all of Northern Europe and much of North America, much of the debate about migration tends to be cast in populist terms as caricaturing those people who move in terms of people who move from poorer spaces to richer places in search of bettering themselves. It's a narrative that is actually fundamentally wrong in all sorts of ways. I'm not entirely so, but largely so. But it is also a context where, I mean, just a few weeks ago, that Elon Musk, that interesting individual, was on a platform with the head of the China Academy of Social Science. And Musk said, and was then met by nods from his colleague from China. And Musk's relationship to China is interesting, actually, in all sorts of ways. But when Musk said that the problem of the next 50 years will be a problem of population collapse rather than population boom, precisely because the demographics of the next 50 years imply both a kind of a planetary population initially of 10 million, but then retreating significantly after that. And it is in that context where societies in Europe and North America in particular are aging rapidly and shrinking frequently across much of that territory. There is also a race for talent, and a race for talent involves trying to effectively produce labor forces for the global north that reproduce and enhance the affluence of those societies. So there is both a market for doctoral students, which a lot of universities of the global north have kind of not exactly colonized, but doctoral students become a source of revenue and income frequently, because they are tied to research grants. They are often tied to other streams of money. So this is not it is not entirely a selfless thing to say that the studentship numbers are opening up at the same time as the research funds may be diminishing. And I say that there are also many dimensions to this about people moving in multiple directions, frankly. And I think the way we think about these things has to be reconsidered. But I mean, I think maybe others here, such as Andy and Juan, might also, Neha yourself, might also have kind of reflections on this. But I suppose that the point I would make more generally is that we need to think both about the importance of flows of knowledge and people in these collaborations, but also some of the processes that inform them, I think.
Yeah, I was going to ask if Andy or Juan want to comment on this, as potentially being locations of places where people go to doctoral programs from, but also actually maybe to reflect a little bit across all of us, span this, on one of the sort of critical aspects of peak urban, which was the production of, junior researchers and sort of next generation of learners and researchers, and how we how we think about that a little bit, perhaps sort of opening up this idea of not just doctoral researchers, but younger researchers and the next generation of researchers more broadly. So I don't know if Andy, Juan, and then maybe Michael and Sue again to think about how we did it with Peak.
Yeah, I mean, I can chip in there. I mean, I think that in the context of particularly, say, African urban research, the challenge is just simply that there is so much that is still unknown and there are so few people who are skilled to do anything about it. So the fact that you can be trained by the ESRC in the UK or by the NRF in South Africa is a great thing in that context. So it's great that the ESRC is opening up to a certain degree, and also the Scottish Graduate School of Social Sciences. But I think that it has to almost be kind of instrumental in terms of why it's being done, because the need is that scholars come back and do research on topics which it's very clear in the African context we're only really touching the beginnings of.
Juan?
Yeah, well, in our case, the PEAK program was like a dream project because it made possible to have like 5 postdocs in our university. They were the first postdocs in our university. And those 4 years, which are about to end, have been great. Yeah, some of the postdocs were living outside. One of them was living in the US, the other one was in UK, the other one was in Australia. And when we got the grant, we were able to bring them to Colombia. And it was a great experience. The big problem now is what are we gonna do after peak ends? No, because the things I already told you in my talk, the continuity of the resources is difficult, even more now with this pandemic. We really need to find some ways to be able to keep that talent here in Colombia, because otherwise, once the project ends, the postdocs, of course, they have to keep looking for jobs. They are gonna go back to the other countries, and we are gonna lose that amazing opportunity. So right now, I'm just crossing fingers to see, to see what are gonna happen with research fundings outside. For us, it's very important what the decisions that are gonna make in the UK, for example, and also trying to find new ways to generate research funding to keep that talent here in Colombia and keep those postdocs interacting with our PhD students and master students and other people here in Colombia.
Michael, I don't know if you want to reflect a little bit on the broader kind of peak story around it.
One of the things that maybe is worth sharing with folk here, I guess, is that one of the things that was following Neha's prompt was that one of the things that we hope to achieve in our theory of change that was built into the Peak Urban program was that the cohort of junior researchers, early career researchers, more to the point, that came through the program would be mobile in several different senses of the term, because we were talking about a mobility intellectually, if you like, across different disciplines, the sense that people could actually move to and away from City Hall, as well as between academic disciplines. It's quite interesting if you look at some of the disciplines that do travel and some of those that don't. There are many people, I'm sure lots of people here know, who are economists or lawyers who have a certain kind of expertise that is seen to travel fairly easily. So you can move in and out of the academy and in and out of the more practical world, whether it's of banks or development agencies or less so in places like city halls. And I think one of the things that we were hoping to achieve was actually to begin to help movement globally. And I think this is recognized globally, that cities need to think about the forms of expertise at their disposal that helps them think about their own futures in ways that bring to bear different forms of knowledge on those futures, and some way of making pathways back and forth from the academy to City Hall was one of the things that was part of our goals, but also part and parcel of our pathway for achieving that, which was unfortunately one of the kind of casualties of the pandemic, I think, was that we had a massive internship program scheduled that was hopefully going to kind of generate a whole series of movements horizontally in all directions of the global compass, quite literally, as scholars moved back and forth, spending significant periods of time in different locations. And that was obviously hit quite seriously. I mean, so much so that if you're in China, one of our colleagues who works in Shanghai now cannot even go to see colleagues in Beijing, because if he goes from Shanghai to Beijing, he has to quarantine for 2 weeks when he goes to Beijing, and then if he goes back to Shanghai, he has to quarantine for another 2 weeks when he goes back to Shanghai from Beijing. So the mobility has been frozen by the pandemic in ways that we all know, which is desperately sad. But I do think that what we did see early on from those internships, and I'd be interested if other colleagues, Neha, yourself included it, would want to say, but from the internships we did see take place, they were incredibly productive for the individuals involved, which actually really does show the possibilities of learning, and learning in a way. This is a bit like the point Andy was making, I think, in his talk, that thinking about how knowledge is moved between places, not to erase the particularity of place, but to think about how knowledge lands in a different place in a different way.
Thanks, Michael. I think, yeah, just reflecting from the IHS experience, I think for us, of course, I mean, to echo what Juan was saying as well about sort of the availability and the ability of resources to be able to sort of engage early career researchers, but particularly in our case, in the absence of a doctoral program, I think it was incredibly, I think, useful for us to be able to kind of, use the peak framework, not just in terms of the funding, but also the kinds of mentorship that became available to young scholars here at IHS through peak, through the research retreats that we were able to organize before the pandemic, and the research cuts shut them down. And I think that in addition to sort of the idea of just the funding, or the resources to be able to sort of help with mobility, I think the kinds of things that are sort of intangible that come with these kinds of research projects are incredibly important. And the ability for younger scholars who might not otherwise get exposure to international networks, to colleagues who work across multiple domains, to be able to, for colleagues to have been able to go to Colombia and spend time interacting with folks there, for people to have been able to come to Bangalore and sort of meet and interact with people here, I think was an incredible learning experience that was very, very valuable. And it's very difficult to sort of put a measure or a metric on some of these kind of intangible processes. And I think that those are kinds of things that we lose with the kinds of shocks that came, both of course with the pandemic, but also with sort of the funding cuts that came. And I mean, I hope that at some point in the future we'll be able to revive some of these processes and conversations. But to me, that those are sort of among the biggest losses of the sort of funding going away, and the frameworks themselves valorizing different kinds of outputs that can't actually measure in terms of publications and citations, etc., but is more fundamentally an investment in sort of the next generation of researchers, which will then hopefully lead to those kinds of more tangible metrics and outcomes, whether in terms of policy impact or academic research. I don't know if anyone else in the panel wants to add to this. Got it. I think we have one other question on sort of mental health and well-being in an urban context. And I'm not sure if they mean in the context of sort of the pandemic or, but I think that and others can reflect on this. But I think that I feel that within Peak we were kind of incredibly understanding about sort of the kinds of challenges that people were facing within the program. We worked, like Michael said at the beginning, collectively together. I think to see the kinds of challenges that people were facing, and then sort of scale our expectations of what the program would be able to do accordingly. Because I mean, all of us were equally affected, both by the inability to do research, but also personally and professionally by the pandemic. But I don't know if any of you have reflections on that.
I can say one thing positive, one thing negative is, I mean, to amplify what Neha said, I mean, the truth is that when the pandemic struck, there were about 85 people who worked on Peak Urban one way or another around the world. And as the pandemic came in very quickly, a number of people were stuck in places they didn't expect to be, stuck in places that they needed not to be. And I guess particularly colleagues in Colombia hosted a number of people for, in some cases, over a year, who could not get back to where they needed to be. And also some people, one colleague arrived in the UK for the first time in their life to sit in a single room in Oxford, a city that they'd never been to before, and be locked down for 6 months. So that the pressures on individuals, particularly young early career researchers, I think were considerable in terms of mental health pressures. And I guess, again, those were shared by many people across the planet in ways that were as bad and much worse, we need to recognize. But the stresses on young early career researchers, I think, was significant. I think more productively, and I think here it's important to thank Michael Ann Mask and Rosaline Cunningham and colleagues in Beijing. We did actually manage to have a virtual retreat in Beijing, which was, candidly, I spent quite a lot of time in China myself. I mean, it could never, these things can never substitute for the intangibles that Neha was describing, but a huge amount of effort was put in by everybody to at least try and generate a sense of collegiality, to extend the principles that had been developed in Bangalore and then amplified in Medellin to actually put together some sense of collegiality, some sense of communication across groups. And I think in the circumstances they were pretty good, thanks to the work of those folk and the other colleagues from around all parts of the globe that kind of put work into that retreat. But it was possible to achieve something virtually. But I guess, as we all know after the pandemic, that there is a limit to 2 dimensions, and seeing people 3-dimensionally has a somewhat greater appeal for all of us, I'm sure.
Andy, Juan, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, just 2 points really. I mean, one, just following on from Michael, I mean, in the context of the experience of Peak and COVID, I think that, obviously the ACC is involved in many different research projects, and something that's really struck me about the Peak project has been that sense of collegiality across all scales in the context of being able to get things done during COVID. And I think, it's a testament to the senior leadership in the program, as much as it is to the junior researchers, that the approach became very much, what can we do realistically? And how can we still produce good work, being mindful of the increased stresses that we were all experiencing during the pandemic. I do see that Aruna was specifically asking about mental health research in an urban context, and something that we picked up on in terms of the projects at the ACC among certain populations that we were researching was obviously that there were mental health challenges associated with the pandemic. I mean, I think that's a self-evident point. I think, you don't need research to see that. But something that we did see as well was a certain sense of resilience among the different groups that were being investigated. One of our projects, for example, is on informal land occupations. Another one that I'm involved in with a colleague, Neha Sami, is on sexuality and health. And what you saw here was that with historically marginalized and precarious communities, in some sense, there was a degree of, I wouldn't say muscle memory, but there was a degree of knowing how to cope with adversity already. And this just became another factor in that. That's not to downplay the severity of COVID on the most marginalized, but I think sometimes compared to other sectors of society, which had not historically had to experience such precarity, there was somewhat of a distinction there in terms of how different people approached it.
In our case, like when the pandemic hit Colombia, like that experience allowed us to understand the importance of collaboration networks. Not only for, collaboration networks are really good to be more productive academically. And, we have 40 postdocs in the network that were working 2 years before the pandemic arrived. So there were already many relationships and a strong collaboration networks. But that network is not only to be more productive academically, but I noticed that network also play an important role to support each other during the pandemic time. If the pandemic hit you alone, is way more different than if you have like colleagues to talk about, to keep busy and working, interacting. So times go faster if you are busy and interacting to other people. And I think that in our case, that make a huge difference. The postdocs were like interacting virtually, but interacting and kept busy during that time. And I think that it helps a lot to mentally and in regard to well-being to go through this pandemic. And also was a good opportunity to test our skills on working together as a group. When the pandemic arrived in Colombia, we were tested because the government asked us about some decisions, economic decisions to be taken here in the region. And we as a group already consolidated 2 years working together. We were able to work together and contribute to some decisions during this pandemic. And that was also very, very interesting exercise to see whether we learn working together the 2 years before and then put that into practice during the pandemic.
Just before we close, I want to ask if anyone on the panel has any final closing comments they'd like to make, or are there any last questions from the audience? If not, I won't keep you from your Friday evenings and afternoons much longer. Thank you all very much for having joined us. Thank you all for listening. And we'll see you all tomorrow for the last day of Urban Arc. We start a bit later tomorrow around 11 a.m. India time. So we'll see you all then. Thank you. Have a good
Many thanks,
evening.
everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.